Yesterday, we had a really interesting conversation with Pedro, and we've got Alex on the call now, and Alex is our resident expert in kernels. And you said you were particularly excited about this kernel paper from Pedro.
I was when I first read this paper, I was like super pumped. Obviously, I think kernels are kind of an interesting thing in general, but along comes this paper that kind of really explains how a lot of the big movements in deep learning, as well as a lot of things that I've kind of seen in my work over the years to do with deep learning, how they all kind of fit together. I mean, we kind of assumed that deep learning must have something to do with kernel methods because there's all that stuff about neural tangent kernels, etc. But here we finally have a really good proof of exactly the mechanics behind all this and how it happens. What's super exciting here is that deep learning models are no longer black boxes. They're kind of more like gray boxes. They're certainly not like interpretable, but now we understand the mechanics behind how it all fits together. And that's a big step forward.
Fantastic. Amazing. Well, I just wanted to put a quick caveat in. So with the conversation with Pedro, he is quite a controversial figure. And certainly a lot of the stuff that I was talking about, especially when I'm talking about what we might call wokeism, and I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, a lot of my information from that came from reading Helen Pluckrose. She wrote that book recently. And I just want to make it clear that I'm not an expert in this. Clearly, I have a view which I've built up after reading that book, and I'm willing to have my view changed. But I don't want you to interpret this as me speaking authoritatively, because I'm really not.
I was quite worried going into this conversation because you never know how it's gonna turn out, right? And Pedro is quite outspoken, for example, on Twitter and so on. And a lot of people, I think, rightfully criticize his behavior there as, something. A lot of people would like to see kind of more moderate discussion, more nuanced points, which is a question if that's even possible, on Twitter. I think it turned out quite well in that we show that you can actually still have a conversation, even if you disagree. There is a danger in having these conversations in that it often devolves into sort of campism, because you divide people into the woke camp and whatever, the left camp and the right camp. And I don't think we can help it. I don't think, at some point, these discussions need to be about, okay, there is a viewpoint that is held by a certain number of people, and now we're going to argue against that viewpoint. But we should never forget that people are individuals, and everyone, no one is the group. Everyone has their own point. And I think even during a conversation, listening to a conversation like this, it's almost inevitable you fall into groupism. But, everyone is a person. And I think that's really important to remember.
I think online, the temperature in these conversations gets turned up quite a bit. We have conversations all the time and disagree about things, and there's never any heat in it because fundamentally we understand people have differences of opinion. Social media as an amplifier takes these disputes and makes it very dangerous and very poisonous very quickly because the human face on the other side disappears.
Exactly, but you see, in the conversation, we can't help but sort of devolve into, oh, these people say that, and just going with they, right? And even we, not elevating us, but even we kind of forget that, every one of those people thinks differently. It's really hard even to have these long form conversations. So as, everyone who's listening today, take everything with a grain of salt.
Welcome back to the Machine Learning Street Talk YouTube channel and podcast with me, Tim Scarf, and my two compadres, MIT PhD Dr. Keith Duggar and Yannick Lightspeed Kilcher. Now, today we have Professor Pedro Domingos. We're going to talk about wokeness, activism in machine learning, cancel culture, AI ethics, and last but not least, kernels. In Pedro's book, The Master Algorithm, he segmented the AI community into 5 distinct tribes with 5 unique identities. And before you ask, no, the irony of an anti-identitarian doing so was not lost on me. But those identities were symbolists, connectionists, evolutionaries, Bayesians, and analogizers. And God knows we've had representation from all of those 5 groups on the show. And as Pedro points out, the Bayesians are overwhelmingly the most passionate. Now, Pedro recently published an article in Quillette called Beating Back Cancel Culture, a case study from the field of artificial intelligence. Anyway, Domingo has railed against wokeism, political activism in the machine learning community, and cancel culture. And recently he was involved in a controversy where he asserted that the NeurIPS broader impact statements were an ideological filter. Anyway, Professor Pedro Domingos, it's an absolute pleasure. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Well, the Quillette article is based on my experience with, being a target of a cancel attack, which was quite interesting, but also quite instructive. And, the editor of Quillette, or the executive editor, Colin Wright, he contacted me even as it was happening, right? They're clearly very on top of Twitter, and asked me if I wanted to write a piece about the incident. And I said yes, and then I thought what would be the most useful thing to do. And I thought, the incident per se maybe is not that interesting. It is, however, interesting as an exemplar of a larger phenomenon. And the episode was nice in that they attempted to cancel me, but they wound up getting canceled themselves. So it shows that you can turn the tables. And so what I wrote was an article with basically a series of points about, how based on my experience and also other things that I know, but illustrated by this episode, on how you can fight back against cancel culture. Because a lot of people are very fatalistic and pessimistic. They say, oh, there's nothing, we can do. You just have to hide. And actually, I don't believe so. You can fight back against them and defeat them. So in a way, the article is a little, set of points for how to fight back, each of them illustrated with what happened in this episode.
I think it'd be really good to go through some of those points. But what I wanted to say, just as an aside, is when I invited you on this show, I used to work in the tech industry, and one of my female ex-colleagues, she reached out to me on Twitter, and she said that I heard that you're talking with Pedro Domingos, and he's a dinosaur, he's going to be on the wrong side of history, and apparently you retweeted an article saying that there was no evidence of bias against women or something like that. So you always have this thing in the background where, okay, so you've overcome cancel culture, but your name seems to be stained forever now. So how do you wrestle with that?
Well, I thank the cancel mob for staining my name forever. I consider it an honor. If they say I'm a dinosaur on the wrong side of history, that actually shows to me that I'm doing something right. Because in fact, I believe that they are the dinosaurs. They think they're the future, but they're really the dead cat bounce of a 21st century ideology. And, the more they rail against me, the more satisfied I am.
Well, I think this brings up something that is probably my biggest problem with cancel culture is that let's suppose they're right that you are a dinosaur. I mean, just maybe you are. We study dinosaurs, right? I mean, even though dinosaurs aren't that advanced or whatever, we still apply science to them. We apply logical argumentation. We study them, etc. The biggest problem I have with cancel culture is it's a form of intellectual laziness and cowardice. It's like I can't address this thing I'm seeing here. There's some type of impedance in my mind, or maybe I just, am too lazy to address it. So I just want to ignore it, and I want everybody else to ignore it too, so I don't hear about it. It's the children putting their fingers in their ears, going la 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 la, like I can't hear you. That's sort of the crux of the problem with cancel culture, from my perspective.
Well, I mean, to be honest, maybe we are the dinosaurs, maybe they are, right?
Right.
I don't know. So the way you find out is by actually debating it. Exactly. But of course, the problem starts with the fact that they do not allow debate. A very central part of this ideology is that if you disagree with them, that proves that they're right. Right? There's these testimonies from students in the classes of some of these people saying, like, why am I not allowed to disagree? Right? I mean, even in this, after this discussion, I've seen episodes with people who are AI researchers on Twitter basically saying no, to other people, you are not allowed to disagree with her. So first of all, we have to establish this fact that you can debate. But of course, this is one of the things that they're trying to kill. And I think we all have our different ideas on AI and on politics, but what we should all be able to agree on is that, we should discuss them. We should be able to discuss them and allowed to, and that's where, some light will come from. We should all agree that you have to stop cancel culture. Cancel culture is about canceling something, in particular, canceling debate. And that's the first thing that we should agree must not happen.
And I love this. I actually love the term cancel culture because it describes I think people are focused on the canceling, but I really want to make a point that it is a culture by now. So I have made a video on one of your papers, the gradient descent models or kernel machines paper, which it's a straight up academic review of a paper and my opinions about the paper. And someone expressed their opinion saying, given how toxic Pedro has been on Twitter, I'm surprised that you are giving him a platform, so to speak. And so 100%, I'm sure this person means no harm. It's like, it is like it is in the culture. Like it is so obvious to that nowadays that you can do this, that you can say, we don't have to, look at these academic ideas because the person behind it has, some dirt on them. And it's a sad state, honestly.
No, and the amount of dirt keeps ever shrinking and the consequences keep ever increasing. So somebody says one thing that somebody in the cancel culture doesn't like, and that's grounds for firing them. And there are many examples of this at this point. I also really, I agree with your point that the cancel is interesting, but the culture is the most important part. And in fact, the culture is the most alarming part because it is a whole culture. And it's easy to dismiss these people as like, oh, the children are restless. But this has gone way beyond that. This is not just restless children anymore. It's actually something very dangerous. To use a biology analogy, and they're popular these days, you can ask, is cancel culture more like a virus or more like a cancer? It's much more like a cancer, right? A cancer is something that's actually organized enough to grow and then kill its host organism, not like a virus, right? And in a way, a virus is easier to deal with than a cancer. So cancel culture has, all the components of a culture, and fighting it is a little bit like fighting an octopus, but you cut off the legs one by one or the arms one by one, and I think that's what we have to do.
I was going to ask, because I think there are elements of religion in wokeism. There are high priests, and I think it's very seductive. I think a lot of people that would have been evangelical Christians or something have kind of taken to this ideology, and it does come from these Foucaultian ideas. I think Foucault was the epitome of these ideas, and he wasn't interested in activism. It became applied in activism in the late 1980s. But there's this knowledge principle, right, which is that it's a construct of language, and there's the political principle, which is that absolutely everything that happens in our society should be interpreted through these interlocking kind of structures of power, and we should be training ourselves to see everything in this way. Is that just reductionist?
People, when they get hit by cancel culture, and when they see its manifestations as they have exploded to public view in the last couple of years, they're often completely flabbergasted because none of it remotely makes any sense. But if you understand postmodernism, it all makes sense to you. You realize how evil it is. But you have, you have to remember that Foucault is probably one of the top few most cited people ever, right? There's these whole fields that have grown up since the 60s that are basically following his ideas, and those of other postmodernists, but he's arguably the most important one. And the central idea, well, there's the number of them, but probably the single most important central idea to what they do is that there is no such thing as objective reality. Right? When you try to engage these people and say like, but wait, what is the evidence that all whites are racist? Right? This is a common one. Or that all men are sexist. And they are not interested in evidence because, the whole idea of validating your beliefs against real data is not important. Right? So this is an ideology that has grown up. And, it's a complex phenomenon, right? There's multiple strands. But a very essential one is that and to your point, it is very much like a religion in that these beliefs are not available to be questioned, which would be bad enough if they were correct, but unfortunately are also incorrect.
Yeah, because I think it's really impenetrable because they use so much technical jargon and people switch off and they spout off all of these clever phrases from Foucault and, you could argue that it enables some kind of mediocre minds to be very successful in that academic world that perhaps wouldn't be so successful otherwise. But you were talking about the white fragility thing. I mean, that's really annoyed a lot of people as well, because it's basically saying that white people have this internalized kind of racism, if you like, and we're completely unaware of it. There's nothing we can do about it. It creates a lot of resentment. It implies that a white person is privileged even if they have no money at all, even if they have no opportunities. They are just automatically privileged. And as a white person, I can't have an opinion on anything, because anything I say is part of this meta narrative. There's a white supremacist discourse, and anything I say is part of that discourse, and it's almost like I don't exist as an individual and nothing I say has any value. You can't really move from that position, can you?
No, I mean, exactly. So another part of this ideology is that there is no such thing as an individual. You are just part of a group. Everything about you is explained by the intersecting set of groups that you're a member of, which is where the whole idea of intersectionality comes from. And again, another very postmodern idea, this one more from Derrida, is that everything is cast in terms of these binaries, one of which is the oppressor and one of which is the oppressed. So, in gender, men are the oppressor, women are the oppressed. In race, whites are the oppressor, blacks are the oppressed, et cetera, et cetera. And everything is formulated in these terms. And then what's happened is that, again, a little bit like biology, this is something that has been growing in the wild and generating, think of it as memes instead of genes, right? This thing has been breeding for decades. And what happens when you let that happen is that you finally, things evolve, and the ones that are most successful at imposing themselves on people's minds actually survive, right? And the early generation of postmodernism was actually not very effective at propagating. It was, quick parenthesis, right? I got my PhD at UC Irvine. I went there because it had, one of the few large machine learning groups in the world at the time. Completely by coincidence, UC Irvine was also one of the leading lights in critical theory. It had this thing called the Critical Theory Institute, where they brought in Derrida and Lyotard, and every quarter there would be a different one of these postmodernists. And I went to some of their classes because I had nothing better to do, right? So I sat in on Derrida, I sat in on Lyotard, and little did the California taxpayers know that their money was being used for this. And I talked with the students in their classes, right? Many of which were like, I don't believe any of this crap. I was like, do you really believe this? Come on, like at lunch, right, after the class. And they're like, no, of course not, but I need to get a PhD. So I'm going to pretend that I believe this until I graduate and have a position, and then, right? And the thing is that, like, this was incredibly enlightening to me, and I read Sokal's book and whatnot. So as this thing has unfolded over the last couple of decades, none of it is really that surprising. But part of what's happened is that this initial ideology was, Derrida is like a stand-up entertainer. The whole thing is like a joke, and we're both in on the joke, and none of it can be taken seriously. So the first generation of postmodernism was like born out of the disappointment with Marxism, and the whole idea that you could have strong beliefs about something was kind of, not in, right? But over the decades, of course, that doesn't have a lot of, propagative ability. That has been replaced by the people who are, hardcore about, no, we're going to impose these ideas. And then, of course, those are the ones that had prevailed over the old kind of postmodernism. And the big thing is that the old kind of postmodernism, yes, your taxpayers' money was being wasted on that, and that class of people, most of them very mediocre, as you very well point out. But, we can live with that. The problem today is that this is now very virulent, and, they are trying to take over society and increasingly succeeding. So, again, to pursue the analogy with cancer, the longer you wait to fight it, the harder it becomes.
Yeah, and Tim, you brought up kind of the manipulation of language. I mean, and Pedro, you mentioned the connection to Marxism. This is exactly what Orwell wrote about. Back in the 40s, right? For example, if you read this fantastic essay called "Politics in the English Language," he talks about this kind of inflated style of writing, right? The kind of Latination of the complexity of everything. That itself is this form of euphemism. And he has a great quote. He says, "A mass of Latin words fell upon the facts like a soft snow, blurring the outline and covering up all the details," right? Like that's what it's about, is making it so obfuscated and so vague that by the end you're not even really sure what you're talking about anymore. And so you might as well agree, or at least you can agree and fit in, into the culture.
But there is a clerical class here, though. I wanted to make this point that I don't think most people actually understand anything about these critical theories, and it's very seductive for a lot of people, because I think there's a real moral currency and lure around oppression and victimhood, and these categories can even further your career at work as well. And when you look at some of these critical theories that have emerged from this, and a lot of this comes from reading Pluckrose, things like disability studies and critical race theory and third wave feminism and queer theory and fat studies and gender studies, and I think a lot of this actually came from a really good place, right? Because people are genuinely concerned about stigmatization. I mean, there's the idea around when homosexuality, for example, it was actually seen as a kind of mental pathology, even by the WHO as recently as the 1990s. And there's nothing wrong with homosexuality. So it's almost as if there was this idea that it's possible that science could be completely wrong. The medical discourse has had this really oppressive effect on folks, and objective truth can't be trusted anymore. But the problem is it's metastasized into all of these weird places now. So like disability studies, where now, for example, a whole identity has arisen around having a disability or even being overweight, and you're not even supposed to aspire to be healthy and to lose weight anymore because there's nothing wrong with being overweight. It's just very peculiar, isn't it?
I mean, all of these things have a point, right? That's the thing is that we can all get behind not discriminating against someone who is different. We can all get behind, someone being in a minority and having it actually harder. Like in many minorities, if you are part of them, you actually have a harder life. And the power behind the message is, I think, that we all recognize that this is true, right? And this is a very powerful thing that I think, in combination with changing up the words of things, has a big effect. So maybe to come back a bit to the machine learning world, I've had my own experiences with kind of cancel culture, and all of this is kind of how. So Pedro, maybe you can sort of describe how does this all feed into your experience with the NeurIPS broader impact statement. What does it even have to do? Like, why did you even start complaining about it? Let's say that.
Actually, what's been happening with NeurIPS is actually a perfect illustration of everything that we've been talking about, which again is why it made for an interesting, I hope, Quillette article. You look at what's happening, right, with this whole crowd of wokeism and whatnot, and then you look at AI, and then you do the thought experiment. What is going to happen when these two things collide, right? And I was actually thinking about this before the collision actually happened. So, and the details are unpredictable and often exceed what you were thinking about. But the outlines of it are not surprising. So, like what's been happening with NeurIPS needs to be understood in terms of how does AI play into what this culture is trying to do, right? And what's happening is that there are all these things that have been put in place. In terms of, for example, preferences by gender and by race, and more generally, like enforcing equal outcomes for these different classes, right? If there's X% men at the start, they have to be at the end, and that's it, right? And that's what they call equity, right? And the problem is that once a lot of the relevant decisions started being made by algorithms, this is in danger. Because the whole assumption in all of this is that humans are so biased, so you have to overwrite them with these laws, right? A lot of these things are in law, right? And again, back to your earlier point, a lot of these laws have a reason to exist because there was discrimination and there is still some. But that movement largely succeeded. And then what do you do, right? How do you disband the army after it's won the war? It doesn't want to be disbanded. It wants to keep being, conquering. And that's when the meaning of the terms start to change. And things that weren't racism or sexism become racism and sexism. And that's where, that takes us where we are today. Now, the problem with, for example, if I use a classifier, to decide whether to interview someone for a job or not, is that classifier, as we all know, is basically a complex formula that was applied to some data, right? Like, think of linear regression, right? Is linear regression racist, right? Now, anybody who knows math thinks like, well, that's just a completely ridiculous thing to suggest, right? Like, how can y equals ax plus b be racist? This is just like, how can you even, take that seriously? However, right, there is this whole field that has grown up in AI, of fairness in AI, a large part of whose agenda is that, like, no, these algorithms have biases and we are going to remove them.
Can I just frame this, because I think we don't need the machine learning algorithms to understand this. I think let's just take a step back. So, for example, we were talking about disability studies. The idea from the social constructivist point of view is that there's a sense of fairness that we all have, and that's why so many people can get on board with this. And we don't want to have discrimination, and all of us, it goes without saying, we abhor all forms of racism and misogyny and transphobia, etc. Of course we do. So it all comes down to this issue of fairness. And a social constructivist would say that the society, if it can afford to do so, should remove all forms of discrimination and unfairness. So as a disabled person, for example, I should be able to cross the road and I shouldn't be impeded in doing so in any way. So I think it all comes from a place where we can't be trusted to make the right decisions, because there are so many machine learning engineers out there, and they can't be trusted to ensure that folks have a completely unimpeded experience, and therefore we need to set up systems or gateways to make sure it happens the right way. Is that roughly it?
Well, exactly. But then the question becomes, who mans those gateways, right? And to use NeurIPS as an example, there's been a whole succession of ways by which this crowd has successively strangled NeurIPS, I would say. And now we're having to deal with it. But the most recent one, and the one that actually started this incident I was involved in, is that NeurIPS papers now are subject to what's called an ethics review. And they have to have what is called a broader impact statement. And there is this sentence in the NeurIPS call for papers that I just find delicious, which says that irrespective of the scientific merit, your paper may be rejected if it promotes unfairness, right? And now let us deconstruct this, right? Appropriate word here, right? We all agree that, fairness is important, right? And again, part of why this crowd is able to get the purchase that it does is that they come at us with these words like ethics and fairness that, like, they're like motherhood and apple pie. Who could disagree, right? And when I push back against this, a lot of the reaction was like, what, you're against ethics? You must be a criminal. But what's going on in this, of course, is that under the cover of ethics, all we actually have is politics. And under the cover of fairness, all we actually have is an agenda to promote some groups at the expense of others. And now, right, to make things better or worse, depending on how you look at it, every paper that I write, for NeurIPS, a paper about, speeding up gradient descent, has to talk about its implications on fairness and things like that. And if they don't like it, they will reject it. There is now, like, a police, an ethics police that says, like, we know what's ethical, and if we don't like your paper, your paper gets rejected because it's not ethical.
So can I challenge you a bit, though? Because, okay, any tool, any process can be abused. Like, I agree with you on that, which is that if there's a board or a committee, and the right or wrong people are on there, and or it's not transparent enough, which I think is, transparency is probably the key importance, but it can be abused. Okay, no doubt about that. However, ethics review boards are certainly nothing new in other fields, like, medical research or whatever. It's been around for quite a while. So I'm wondering, if you think there's a role at all for any kind of ethics review within the machine learning and AI community, and if there is, how should these boards be structured or improved, to have limiting principles, if you will, to keep them from kind of going down a slippery slope or being abused?
Very good question. So I very much agree that there's an important place for ethics in AI, right? And part of why I wrote the master algorithm, and I say that in the book, right? One of my main motivations is that everybody needs to be aware of the issues so that they can make informed decisions about it. Because these ethical and political decisions and so on, in a democracy, they're supposed to be made by everybody, right? And now you say, and this is the example that people always bring up. Say, like, oh, but in medicine, there are ethics review boards. Therefore, there should be ethics review boards in AI. This is a bad inference. This is a bit like saying, like, I need to cover my eyes from the sun. Therefore, I need to cover my eyes from a candle. The question that we need to ask ourselves is, like, where in AI does this need to happen, right? I'm not saying that it doesn't need to happen anywhere at all, right? I'm not saying that there's no ethics of AI. Of course there is, right? But now, should there be an ethics review of NeurIPS papers? Does every NeurIPS paper need to have a section on broader impacts? I don't think so. And this is something that you can debate, right? And we were actually debating this for a few days before the cancel mob moved in. And why they moved in, I think, is an interesting illustration. But I think that a paper that is, for example, about speeding up gradient descent doesn't need to have a broader impact section.
Mm-hmm. One point there, like this, because it's a good example, speeding up gradient descent, why would that have any ethics implications? Let me just give you a straw man or a steel man, for that argument. Okay, for example, in Timnit Gebru's, paper, the one that's, caused some controversy sort of recently, one kind of point that they raise in there, which I personally agree with, is that as, say, deep neural networks become yet larger and ever billions of parameters or whatever, they become ever more outside of the realm of human kind of understanding of what's happening inside that algorithm. And we know that, if there are things in the data that it can find that are proxies for stuff like race or, ethnicity or whatever, it can find them. Things like zip code in the United States, for example. Okay, and so as they become more and more complex, they become less amenable to our oversight, if you will. And so speeding up gradient descent, say if it enables us to go from 1 billion to 100 billion parameters, actually can make that problem worse, right? And so if I was writing a paper and submitting that to NeurIPS, I might put that in my broader impact statement. I might say, in fact, this could allow like ever larger models. We need to think very carefully about the increase in complexity, oversight. Isn't that fair?
Completely fair. You can put that in your paper, and some people will. But there's two important points here. That is not the question here. The question is, should you be forced to put that in the paper? And right now you are. Right?
Yeah.
That's what I'm against. It's like, people can put whatever they want in their papers, and discussing the social implications is great. It's fine. What I'm against is having a requirement that everybody has to discuss this. And the second point is, and then what happens that's the other part, is like what that gets used for. But the second, but the other side of this is the following: I am not saying that gradient descent does not have social or ethical implications. Of course it does, and you just give an example, and there are many more. What I'm contesting is that every paper that is written about gradient descent needs to have a discussion of those ethical implications. This is ridiculous. It's just like wasting everybody's time, right? I think I'm very much in favor of scientists being aware of the social implications of the work that they do. I myself am motivated not just by or in particular by the science being interesting, but by the applications, right? But everybody doesn't have to be talking about that in every one of the papers that they do. The community as a whole needs to have an interface to society, and the community as a whole needs to be dealing with the social, political, ethical implications of what it does. The idea that every time that I write a paper that shaves, an order of n off the speed of an algorithm, I have to talk about society and what this means, to me is just ridiculous.
Yeah. I can see this both ways, right? So the nuclear scientists, they said no, because they could clearly see the consequences of what they were doing. But I'm also skeptical whether you even can see the consequences of what you do. That I already think, even without the broader impact statements, there's so much groupthink and myopia in the scientific community. That's why we're not really exploring. I mean, Kenneth Stanley would say that we're not exploring, we're exploiting. But the broader impact statements in practice, they don't carry any information at all. They just say technology good, technology bad, technology biased. They're completely formulaic in their construction.
Hey, I called
box-ticking exercise.
And
I stole that from Yannick.
You have to make the sign. You have to make technology good, technology bad, technology biased.
I stole that from Kilcher, but no. But the thing is, I think it stifles innovation, and also it clearly hasn't demonstrated any effect whatsoever. And the folks that are on these boards are of a certain political persuasion. It would be different because I'm a big fan of having diversity of viewpoints. I think that can have an interesting effect in terms of being able to see potential consequences if that's even possible. But that's just not being proven out with this at all.
No, on the contrary, what this promotes is not diversity of viewpoints. It's funneling everything into the viewpoint of these people who, at least some of them, are quite explicit that these are just tactics to impose their view on us, right? There was this workshop at NeurIPS, right, on broader impacts, where some of the people who crafted this whole thing were there, including the head of the ethics board and so on. And one of them said, like, we are doing these things because they are the low-hanging fruit. The review process is the low-hanging fruit for the agenda that we want to impose. There was no discussion in that whole, panel that I saw of whether this is good or bad. The only discussion was of how.
So there's two things, right? And on one hand, you can say, look, what does it hurt? What does it hurt to make, even to force everyone to think about the ethical implications, right? What is the, even, we force someone, it can't hurt, right? But on the other hand, a bit my question to you is how much of that, and you already alluded to it, is not as much about ethics as it is about politics and power? Because I've made a video when they introduced this requirement, and you could actually see the kind of power struggle in real time. At first, one of the representatives of NeurIPS gave an interview, and in the interview they said, oh, the broader impact statement, it will be in the appendix, and it will only be visible, I think, after submission, and so on. And then in the next kind of iteration, it was, no, the broader impact statement will be in the main part, and it will be visible, but you must not do any decision about it. And then in the next iteration, it was, oh, now you can get rejected because of it, but if your work is very theoretical, you can say this doesn't apply to us. But then they link to like blog posts, so it's not official communication, but they officially link to them. And these blog posts essentially say, you might want to put a lot of work into it, even if your work is theoretical, because if you don't, then we're just sort of going to assume that the rest of the paper has also been done with not enough care and not enough kind of sloppy, as you did the broader impact statement. So you could see in real time, like how this got up and up and up, and that makes me kind of doubt that it is about ethics, and I have my troubles, right? Even though the motivation is, even the forcing can be like, what does it hurt to make everyone think about the broader impacts?
And there's two answers to that question. The first, which is actually the less important one, is that even if you take it at face value, if you shouldn't, it does hurt because, me spending a few hours writing a broader impact statement is not a big deal, but 10,000 people times that number of hours is a big deal, number one, right? But that enough is reason not to have, ethics statements for most NeurIPS papers, right? Particularly the ones that are not about a specific application, but that are about general techniques, like, speeding up, gradient descent, or whatever. But that's actually the least important part of this. In fact, when we have this discussion, we're actually playing their game because we're confusing the camouflage for the real thing, right? It's saying like, oh, there's nothing wrong with these broader impact segments because, everybody cares about broader impact segments. These things are a cover for an agenda to impose a particular set of views. And again, you just, showed step by step what happens. And, one of the pushbacks that I got, was, from Raya Hetzel, I think, not just anybody, a co-chair of NeurIPS this year was, but we only rejected 4 papers. So who should worry about 4 papers being rejected, right? Who cares? It's no big deal, right?
Yeah,
and this,
4 papers today.
In my mind, what it reminded me of was like when the Taliban, conquered one town after another in Afghanistan. One of the, key pieces of their MO was they hung a few people. It didn't even matter who was being hung. They just hung them in the public square, right? And you could say like, but we only hung 2 people in a town of 10,000. What is the problem? This is how everybody else gets controlled. And this is exactly the process by which that happens. And we have to see through it.
Well, but it's great to see through that. Okay. But on the other hand, just because somebody has an agenda doesn't mean that all the things that they suggest are necessarily bad ideas, right? I mean, in other words, a lot of what needs to move forward in terms of public goods, society processes, whatever, has to be had through compromise. So it's like, okay, people with agenda A are sitting over there and agenda B are on the other side of the table and C is somewhere in between. And we got to come together and hash out and discuss these. And a lot of what you're pointing out, there are slippery slopes for sure. And so we have to hash out what those limiting principles are and making sure that we develop a process, that incorporates your objections, that incorporates the objections of whatever other people with agendas, don't we?
I think it's the application of technology, where you actually have the real impact. But I want to try and steelman this a little bit. So Kate Crawford did a presentation at NeurIPS, I think, in about 2018, and she was speaking about some of the harms of biased algorithms. I mean, you can think of some bad examples like the Chinese criminality detection using physiognomy and phrenology and the social credit score system in China. And, basically her thesis, by the way, was that we need to have some kind of a trustworthy class of people who understand all of these power structures in society, and the implication is that ML engineers don't get it. They have to be social scientists, and even if they're not social scientists, they have to be something else. But you can go through all of the different harms, right? So it's things like the classification of people. You're putting people into buckets. In 2016, there were already 16 genders on Facebook, and I'm sure it's increased dramatically since then. Harms of representation, so selection bias or racial stereotyping, resource or allotment allocation, so who gets mortgages, underrepresentation, so we think of CEOs as being white people, or denigration. So if you type into GPT-3, if you say a Muslim walks into a store and let it complete, I mean, you can guess what it will say, and things like measurement and proxy bias. And she even provides some potential solutions, so things like neutralizing the data, or equal representation, or awareness, or fairness forensics. And let's get into this discussion of what is fairness. Should we debias these data sets, and what would that look like?
Well, exactly. So the problem with this whole agenda of debiasing the data sets is, well, actually, it's more than one problem. But the first and most important problem that I have with this is that, to me, and maybe I'm just a naive machine learning engineer, the purpose of a model is to reflect the world as accurately as possible. And then, based on that accurate perception of reality, we can make whatever decisions we want. Now, we can have a process that uses a machine learning algorithm that has whatever objective function we design, right? And that's where the social debate needs to come in, not in the optimization and representation part. Those are essentially technical problems, right? We can then decide what the goals are. But a lot of the agenda here is like this. It's really blaming the messenger. It says like, oh, there's bigoted pages on the web, and you're not allowed to learn from them. Or an even better example that I just find delicious is this whole thing about embeddings and whatnot that say like, oh, embeddings are so biased. Because what? Because they find that there's a greater correlation between man and programmer than between woman and programmer. Right? You've probably seen all these examples, right? They associate men with programmers and women with someone, teacher
Sure.
or something that women more often do. And then they want to debias the data set because this is wrong.
But
right?
the thing is, I want to steel man their argument here, because if you did believe that there was a patriarchy and there was a white supremacist force in society and so on, I can understand their thought process. They think that the only reason we don't have more women software engineers is because of all this male toxicity and patriarchy, and it's not an encouraging place for them to come and work. So we need to tweak a few knobs and levers to balance it out. So what do you think about that?
Oh, I completely understand that thought process, but just to do the if-then statement, right? Even if that was what I believed, right, I would not advocate that the way to do this is to change the data. This is a little paradoxical, right? There's a problem that there aren't enough female programmers. Let's say that is a problem, right? Then what do? You erase the data that says there's a problem, right? This is a little like saying, like, what I'm going to do is replace the world that I want with the world that I have with the fantasy one that I want, and that is the right thing to do. Right.
But that would work, though. That's what they want to do. So they want us to preferentially, let's say, hire more female software engineers, and it would do that. So
it wouldn't even work. Like, I mean, and again, I understand the frame of mind, right? And like, so let me sort of like try to state that side of things for just a second. And again, as in all of these things, going back to postmodernism, it actually starts with the kernel of truth, right? And the kernel of truth here is that perception is important to reality, right? If women see that all programmers are male, they will not be interested in going into computer science, right? And therefore, how do we fight that? We change the perception, right? And I think there are some aspects of that are acceptable. Like, for example, Hollywood movies these days, they often have female judges or black CEOs, right? Because like that just plants in your mind that they don't have to be white men, right? But now first of all, you have to balance the good that does against the harm. And, a Hollywood movie is a Hollywood movie, right? That's one thing, right? Another thing is that, and in some ways, this is the most important one, and we've seen this at work in the last few decades, is that people aren't stupid. And sooner or later, they perceive that they're being duped. And then they become even more skeptical. Like this is the perverse thing about this. They're like, oh, but women and men don't go into programming, at equal rates. You've been lying to me. I don't believe your crap. I don't believe the experts anymore, right? And this is not what you see. What's happening is like people are completely skeptical of us, the experts, because they realize that we've been politicized. And moreover, when you do this, right, and then you say like, oh, like we just hired this woman, then perversely, what this does is it justifies the sexism. It says like, oh, you hired her because, right? So even on the terms of what this crowd wants, ultimately these things are counterproductive.
I feel there are two things at work. You said, I want a model that reflects the world as accurately as it is. And there are actually problems with the models that we have. So for example, very often our data sets, they aren't the world. They're like a collection of the world since 1950. And, we're sort of telling the model, look, this is all equally valid, which it is not. And then there are other problems. For example, machine learning models necessarily or sometimes need to kind of compress the data. And so a good way to reduce your loss function is actually to just memorize the majority and just forget the minority, right? So you can make a good case that machine learning models, even in their essence, have an effect of actually not representing the world, but to introduce their own biases. And I can completely understand this, people saying this and saying, look, we need to do something about that. But then on the other hand, I also feel, as I said, there's two effects at work. Two things can be true at the same time. These models do have their problems, but also there is a completely different thing when you say, I don't like the world as it is. I'm going to make my model say something else because I want to have a certain effect. And these things, they get mixed up. And I don't like that, and I often feel they deliberately get mixed up in that it's justifying the second thing by quoting the first thing.
Well, models have lots of problems, of course. That's why we machine learning researchers have jobs, right? But it's important to understand what the problems are and what the valid solutions are, right? So the first problem is the data, right? We have this beautiful fiction in statistics and machine learning of the IID data set, right? There is no such thing, right? Back in the days of Ronald Fisher, when you could spend a lot of time assembling a data set of, a design matrix, right? Notice the word design there, right? You could try to really make sure that this was a representative sample of the world. And we all know that this is not a new problem, right? Your sample should be representative of the world. If the data isn't representative of the world, you learn a bad model, right? This has nothing to do with fairness. This is just it's not something that affects, gender or race or whatever specific. This is just doing good machine learning, right? And we always need to be fighting that battle, both as researchers and as data scientists. But at the same time, right, there's something important that you have to realize, which is it's a battle that cannot be won. And if we insisted on doing machine learning with all the beautiful and great and laudable guidelines that we have from statistical theory, we wouldn't have machine learning today. All of these goods that machine learning does wouldn't be there because we would still be in the lab figuring out how we're going to make this data set more perfect, right? So this is not realistic. Again, it's not a reason for giving up, right? It is our job to try to make the data as clean, as representative as possible. But the bigger the data set and therefore more powerful, the less of this is going to be possible, right? And that's not a reason to stop. And moreover, again, the agenda of these people is not dealing with this in general, is to focus on some variables to the expense of others. And I have a big problem with that because the whole point of machine learning is that it allows personalization. It allows, catering to the individual as opposed to putting them in a few boxes of, oh, you're a white male and therefore this is what happens to you, right? So doing that is the negation of machine learning in my view.
Let's take just a super simple example that I hope we can all agree. If I'm building a hand wash dispenser that, people stick their hands under it and it uses whatever, some kind of machine learning algorithm on light sensors to decide that it's actually a human hand and it should dispense a certain quantity of soap. I'm assuming we all agree that that should work equally well for all skin colors, right?
No, actually, you're right. This is a great example because it's so simple, right? But it worries me, right? Precisely because of what I just said. Why? So actually, the way to do this, right, is to do the following. Like, I'm going to design, a soap dispenser. I have a sensor, right? What is my objective function, right? It doesn't have anything to do with skin color. It's that, let's say that we are egalitarian. I am, right? Ideally, it should work equally well for all people. Ideally, right? But but if it doesn't, right, then what I have to do is make it the best possible, even if I sacrifice some things for the sake of others, right? Because some of those trade-offs are inevitable, right? And the example that you're posing, it says, like, why are we favoring skin color over everything else? What is special about skin color? I would actually argue that that is a racist point of view, to say I'm going to worry about skin color when working on a soap dispenser, as opposed to treating everybody equally, right? And again, to pursue that example a little further, some skin colors might be harder to detect than others.
That's right.
In particular, facial recognition is harder when you have less contrast, et cetera, right?
But that's the point
we can debate what is the best way to deal with this, but it is absolutely not a given that we should just aim for skin colors to be, equal, for the detector to be equally good at two different skin colors. Maybe that's what we want, maybe that's not, but that is not an assumption that we should start from.
Well, I can tell you in the United States, that's an assumption you should start from, because it's a legal requirement that it treats all people equally regardless of skin color, right? And so if we could just posit, let's just suppose that is a requirement, that when people put their hands under there, it has to perform equally well regardless of their skin tone, okay? How do you suggest that we go about, and let's imagine the data sample is skewed, right? Like, because only 13% of the population is black and 50% is white or whatever, so we have a skewed data sample, right? How do we go about making sure that our end product works equally well for all skin tones?
So, but what you're saying, that the law in the United States requires that soap dispensers work equally well for different skin colors?
Yes, I am.
Here is where you actually can make the case for something like a broader impact statement, because it is not the dispenser, because the dispenser has downstream effects. If some people, in the extreme, can't wash their hands as well, they lose more time, they are more prone to infections because the soap dispenser didn't work. There are all these downstream effects that this can have, and you being the capitalists that we are just going to worry, like, where do we put more effort? We're going to put more effort into selling more to the majority and not to the minorities, and this kind of triggers a feedback loop and so on. So there is a good case to be made for kind of the laws that Keith, mentioned.
Yeah. Could I just touch on the feedback loop thing? Because there is a kind of patriarchal aspect here that I think these people want to protect us from ourselves. It's one of the reasons why the Social Dilemma film was quite fascinating, because it creates this very strange behavior, this emergent behavior where it deranges our attention, and all of these weird addictive behaviors emerge out of nowhere. And it's a similar thing with AI systems, right? Even if you had a system that perfectly modeled reality as it is now, it would still, from a progressive point of view, this is your worst nightmare, because it's gonna stagnate society. It's gonna stop society from moving where we want to go.
Okay, so let's take this one part at a time, right? We can ask. So I'm curious exactly what law says soap dispensers have to be skin invariant. But let's assume that law exists. Well, there's the first part is that law is wrong, right? But let's table that, right? And we can discuss why I think it's wrong, right? But let's ignore that it's wrong and just take it as a given. And now your question, I assume, is like, so what do we do about this?
That's right. Yep.
Well, we can actually do what people do, which is we can have it, as a constraint in our whole system, not the learned model in the end-to-end system that, the outcome has to be X, Y, Z, right? And we can discuss what that outcome should be. But again, The problem with a lot of what's happening is that it's not about fostering a discussion about the outcome should be. It's just like, this is the outcome that we want, and if you either hew to it or you get silenced, your paper gets rejected, whatever, whatever. Right? So under the cover, very postmodernly, under the cover of let's have discussion, what this thing is doing is preventing discussion, right? But now there's another problem with this. This is that like these requirements aren't even self-consistent, right? If you take the sum total of the legal requirements, let's take more important things like job, applications and policing and whatnot. These things are mutually contradictory. You can actually not even have them all at the same time. So if we as engineers say like, oh yeah, I'm just going to obey all of these laws, it's physically impossible to maximize at the same time because they're dependent. So we're in a position which is very well known of people in communist countries and whatnot, like we are all sinners. No matter what you do, you're doing it wrong.
No, I understand. I understand the point you're making, but I'm still so. Look, all tools can be abused again, right? And for example, fairness. I mean, I've been in multiple fairness discussions, right? And every time I ask, what is the state of the art for the definition of fairness, I never really get a good example. For example, we once discussed the allotment thing. Well, if more than pro rata of mortgages are going to this group, then it's not fair. And I said, okay, so let me just ask the question. If I build a neural network that allots 99% of mammograms to women, is that fair? And that usually throws a wrench kind of in their whole process because we know that 99% of breast cancer cases, occur in biological, XX individuals, and therefore we should allot more mammograms to them. And so, on the one hand, I think there should be a very public and transparent conversation and maybe one day actually a database that says, these factors you can use for X purpose, but you can't use them for this purpose. And so, for example, skin color. I don't think skin color should affect whether or not you get soap when you put your hand under a dispenser. I do think gender should affect whether or not you're allocated a mammogram. I do think race can actually impact medical suggestions. Like you said, there are racial variabilities, right? And your susceptibility to different diseases. And we want to account for all of that. So the right solution isn't just to ignore these factors. It's to have a very transparent conversation about which are usable for what purpose. But once we come to that conclusion, we've got to have a tool set to actually do that. And I'm asking you, what tool set do you think should be used to achieve, for example, equal dispensing of soap?
Just before we get to that, can I just test a couple of principles? There are lots of things that we decide as a society are fair or moral, and we change our mind progressively over time. And even things like, we wear seatbelts. At some point, we didn't need to wear seatbelts. And at the time, everyone decried wearing seatbelts. And now we would never turn the clock back. And there must be lots of things that we agree on here, just, on our moral compass. I mean, we shouldn't discriminate against homosexual people, for example. What if it were the case that there was lots of latent discrimination against homosexual people, and we thought that they were not competent programmers. So because of that lasting prejudice, we didn't hire any gay people, and all of our models have learned not to hire gay people. And we know for sure that that's a ridiculous rule. The model shouldn't have learned that rule. What do we do then? Is that something we should neutralize?
Very good example and very good points, right? And I think, Keith, you're saying we need to have a conversation about which variables we use when and how, right? So let's have that conversation, right? And here's what I think should be done, right? It's actually very simple, right? Is when you're learning a model to predict something, right? All variables are fair game. In fact, you're not doing the rational thing if you do not use all the relevant information. And you're not a good Bayesian if that's your persuasion, right? Bayesianism says you have to use all the available evidence or you're doing the wrong thing, right? Therefore, variables like race, gender, sexual orientation should be a priori allowed for whatever decision you want to make because they might be relevant. Whether or not they're relevant is a matter of is. It's not a matter of ought. The problem that I have with all of this is that the ought is infecting the is. But let me finish. They should be used on equal terms with the other variables. I shouldn't say, so there's this schizophrenic thing of I either can't use those variables or I'm forced to use them over and above all others. And both of these things are wrong. Learn your model and those variables will have whatever, place they have. Right now, to go back to the homosexual program as the example, right? Let's say, I'm Google. and I'm writing a program to rate people as to how likely they are to be good programmers, right? And one of the available variables is their sexual orientation, right? Now, there's two parts to this, at least. One of them is if their sexual orientation truly is relevant to their skill as programmers, that variable will not be in the model and the problem is solved, right? Another possibility is that homosexuality really is relevant to being a good programmer. Maybe gay people are better programmers, in which case they should be favored to the extent that that favors them, right? So that's the other aspect. But then there's a very important one, which again keeps coming up in all this, which is like, but what if the data that I'm learning from was the decisions of previous hiring committees and they were biased against gay people, and therefore they show up as not being good programmers? And that is a real problem, right? But it's a data quality problem that we've already talked about, right? The problem there is that I'm learning from bad data, therefore I'm learning a bad model. So what you do there, let's pick a better example, which is credit assignment, and a very salient one. There are laws about this and redlining and whatnot, right? Is what am I making when I'm learning? And I've used data sets like this, right? Data sets of credit decisions. Is the class variable something that was produced by a biased human labeler, in which case there's something to worry about, or was it the outcome? Right? The outcome is this person paid their loan or this person did not pay their loan, and these are completely different things. The outcome is the outcome, right? And now you could say, oh, but they didn't pay their loan because there were race biases against them and what. And I'm like, maybe, but that's your hypothesis now, right? And if my goal is simply to not go out of business and make good loans and so forth, I'm actually authorized to use those decisions. But it's very different, right? Whether the label was produced by a human versus where the label is an outcome of the real world.
I actually want to go back a little bit, coming back to this the kind of NeurIPS discussion. Now you've started talking about how what issue you had with broader impact statements, and then this whole thing happened to you, right? And the article you wrote is I like a lot of it, and you give some recommendations of what to do when something like this happens to you. And as I said, having experienced a much smaller scale of this, but it can definitely relate. Things like, pick your battles, know what to expect, don't back down. So I encourage anyone to actually read this article. Though I do have, so you have one suggestion in there, which is turn their weapons against them. And I just want to maybe, if you allow me, just read this here. You say, you may find this to be the most controversial principle, and yes, I do, but it is also arguably the most crucial, as the cancellers won't stop until they fear that they'll endure the same consequences that they seek to impose on others. In my case, I watched as investors and customers leaned on the ringleader's company to rein them in. Even companies that posture heavily in the area of social justice don't actually want to be stained by the disgraceful behavior of mob leaders. Indeed, I have no doubt that it was an ultimatum from that person's employer that finally led to her to stop Twitter and so on. So you say, and you say at the end, some will say that once we resort to this step, we become as bad as the cancellers. But that's a false equivalence. The cancel crowd tries to ban people because of their views. We try to stop bullying, behavior that is reprehensible regardless of ideology. So this is something I don't agree with. Even if I think someone is a bully and so on, I would not go to their employer and be like, look, because that's like, I feel if you go to someone's employer, you're like, take a look at yourself. Like that's a place where I don't go. And because the people, they would claim you're the bully, and therefore they have every right to go to your employer, right? They would claim they have every right to go dig up dirt on you because all they want to do is stop your bullying, right? And you do your Twitter presence is not not the most nuanced, if I can be honest. You voice your opinions, and I feel sometimes you do it also a little bit to get a reaction. And you're not by far not at the end of the spectrum. Even in this debate, there has been multiple people, I think one of them is now suspended, that clearly are only there to incite, to inflame tensions. They go in and they get a little bit offended. They're like, I'll sue you. And so there is this, behavior. And why aren't you the bully? Like, what right how can you say we should stop them with their methods because they're the bullies? How does this not apply to you?
Can I just quickly add on to that as well? Because there is an element of you fighting fire with fire. And I must admit, one of the things I want to explore with you is it the substrate of Twitter? Because I think many people involved in this discussion are good people, and Twitter has brought the worst out in you. And I think the way you've behaved on Twitter does slightly discredit your argument, Pedro. Just being honest, I think that you've gone over a line that I wouldn't go over. And why did that happen?
Well, to answer your question first, I don't think I've gone over any lines, obviously. I'm not on Twitter to get a rise out of anybody. I'm just presenting my views. It is true that, very much so, let's be very clear about that. And even some of the people that you say were only, Yannick, that you said were only there to influence people, they weren't, because I've actually talked with them. And, I don't necessarily agree with what they did, but, I agree with their motivations and with a lot of what they said. But, to get to the main point here, this is really, I think this is crucial. Again, of everything in that article, this is indeed the most important point. And because this is why we're losing this war. It's because, the other side has guns and we think guns are immoral, so we let them shoot us. So we have to, and we really need, I think, and I've had discussions with a lot of people about this, and I understand why this is a tricky point, which is why we need to address it head on. I think, first of all, we need to distinguish the ends and the means, right? The cancel crowd's goal is to silence people who express their views. My goal is to let everyone express their views. I believe that my goal is a good one and their goal is a bad one. So the first way in which we're different is that we differ on goals. They're using these tools, these weapons, for bad goals, and we're using them for good goals. Again, just because the Nazis, to bring up the Nazis, had guns, doesn't mean that the Allies were wrong to have guns, right? Because if the Allies didn't have tanks and airplanes, the war would have been lost. So this is the first important thing to realize, right? But the second one, which I think confuses people even more, is the following, is that I'm not saying that the full range of weapons is okay. Absolutely not. So what things are okay versus aren't? And again, I say that in other parts of the article. Insulting people is never okay. Taunting people is never okay. Telling lies is not okay, etc., etc. So there's a whole bunch of things that I do not condone, and I have said that I do not condone, right? But now let's talk specifically about things like leaning on employers, or boycotting organizations that do the wrong thing. Is that fair game? It absolutely is fair game. All sorts of great things have been accomplished by doing that, right? Boycotting South Africa helped to end apartheid. And it's like there was a debate. Are we making are we making people suffer for nothing, right? But I think, as a principle in general, leaning on organization. Look, I'm a customer of a lot of companies. I'm totally free to say, I'm not going to buy your product because I don't like what you do. So when the wokes do that, I may disagree with the reason they're doing it, but I'm not saying they don't have a right to, right?
Yeah, but you're it's a different thing, because very often that's not what's going on, right? When people, for example, contacted my employer, I had some people say, "What? We're not canceling you. We're just expressing our opinion into the direction of your employer," and basically saying that, well, it is perfectly okay to inform your employer of what you're doing, and if they decide that's reprehensible, then they have every right to let you go, which is true. However, what often the goal of something like this is that you simply make it a PR problem for the employer. You write an email, "I'm very concerned that this behavior," and so on, and you're counting on the fact that your employer doesn't have a lot of time, doesn't have a lot of insight into the matter, simply sees the word, like a bunch of bad words associated with an employee, and then does something to kind of make its public image look good. And this is, to me, like, I really disagree with this fighting fire by fire, because you legitimize the tactics of those people.
I understand, right? Again, I have felt that as well, right? So I've been the target of that, right? One of the first things they did was target my university and every other organization that I'm a part of. And here's the thing, they already used that tool extensively against us. Why can we not use it against them? It's unilateral disarmament, right? What the employer should do in that case is say, like, look, go away, right? But often they don't, right? Precisely because of these problems. But and the problem is that as a tool, this is extremely effective. In fact, people insulting you on Twitter, well, big deal, right? That happens every day. Losing a job, well, that really is a big deal, right? If we allow them to use that against us and we don't use that against them, we are doomed, right? You got to fight fire with fire, right?
I disagree. So, that's just because you legitimize it, right? Because they say, look, your behavior on Twitter makes the space unsafe. Some people feel, they feel unsafe. Therefore, you're the bully. Therefore, and since you even admit you would use those tactics, why can't they use the tactics?
Again, there's a very, very important another extremely important distinction to be made here is degree, right? These things, even at this level, are not equivalent, because this cancel crowd goes to my employer for pushing back against NeurIPS ethics statements. Yes, I mean, let me make this point in more abstract terms, right? We should not ask a binary question, is it ever okay to complain to your employer, right? That is too crude. The question that we should ask, which includes that one as a special case, is like, what is the behavior, what are the actions that merit complaining to your employer? And I believe the threshold for that should be high. You don't go to your employer for whatever somebody said on Twitter, right? That's just like not the point, right? But there is a level beyond which actually it is true that your employee has reason to be concerned with how the behavior of the person will reflect badly on them. So part of the problem with this crowd is that they have the threshold in the wrong place. Just right, like everything that you do, right? So I think there's these distinctions that we have to make about what is acceptable and what's not.
And I think, Yannick, that's kind of a key differentiator here is that Pedro does have limits. I mean, he pointed out some limits beyond which he wouldn't go, and there's a matter of degree here. And I think a big problem right now with kind of a lot of the cancel culture crowd is they actually haven't even defined any limits for themselves. It's like even your children aren't off limits. They would send tweets and emails to your kids' schools if they knew how, and say that they should be booted out of the school because of the sins of the father, and things like that. I think if they want to be, let me give them some advice out there. I think in the long term, if they want to be more successful in achieving some of their agenda points that maybe a lot of other people might agree with, like equal dispensing of soap or something like that, that they should learn where their limits are, and they should adopt some limiting principles. It's like, okay, should NeurIPS have been renamed to NeurIPS? Well, maybe there's some criteria there, like what should we base it on? Like the percentage of attendees that are upset, or should we base it on the size of their Twitter following? If it's offensive in one language, is that enough? What if it's a minor world dialect? We need some like kind of limiting principles so that we're not just like going around in circles, kind of renaming everything to a numerical value or something.
Yeah. The problem with that, though, is we're getting into the whole discussion about safe spaces and fragility, and it's impossible now to have a conversation without offending at least one person.
Well, I think we're going into the direction of now we have to decide arbiters of these thresholds, right? We have to, and this is, I mean, of course, thresholds like this exist, and society as a whole has to find limits. I'm just saying we can raise the threshold by not using kind of these tactics, and these tactics ultimately, they are made to distract from the actual issues. Like if your first reaction to someone disagreeing with you is, this person is making an unsafe space, I'm going to dig up dirt on them so I can kind of circumvent the argument. That's almost like an admission that You're not in it for the argument. I think what we should do is, in all of these things, bring it back to the argument. Like relentlessly bring it back, being like, no one cares who you are. No one cares who you work for, right? You're saying something, And even though you might make the argument they're kind of not serious, like they follow a hidden agenda or whatnot, even then we bring it back to the argument, and we're just showing that, look, we can discuss on what you're saying. I don't care who you are. And I think that's the way to go, honestly.
I think Pedro actually made a very similar point in his list of tactics.
Bringing it back to the key point. Don't descend into the same kind of thing that they do. I think that's absolutely essential. Another thing that I think is essential is a very simple principle is everyone needs to grow a thicker skin. And I have a thick skin, which I think is good. Everybody needs to have a thick skin. Unfortunately, what happens right now is that being offended is rewarded, right? I believe in the economists and the notion that it's all about incentives, right? Right now, you have an incentive to be offended. Being offended is power. If I'm a victim, I'm powerful. I get to impose what I want by calling myself a victim. So everybody's competing to see who's the bigger victim. And this is what drives intersectionality, right? Intersectionality is purely like, oh, I have more victim points than you do. And there's a scramble, right, for that, right? And what we have to realize is like, no, this is what's wrong, right? Like, victim points should not exist, right? So when we stop rewarding these behaviors, they will stop happening. And as long as we reward them, they will continue to grow.
I agree with that. And I've even had experience in the corporate world where I've seen the inversion of power, where you can claim to be offended, or someone's appropriated your culture, or someone's discriminated against you, and very, very senior managers can get fired because of it, because we take it so seriously. Anyway, look, we've only got about 15 minutes left, and I really want to move the conversation over to your kernel paper. So you've recently released a paper called Deep Networks Are Kernel Machines. And why this is fascinating, remember in your book you actually said that the analogizers and the connectionists were in two different camps. I don't know whether this changes that, but the fascinating thing is that the way that we pitch neural networks, it's always been the big sales pitch that we can learn representations as part of the training process, and all this magic stuff is going on. And you apparently seem to have demonstrated in some sense that a trained neural network has an equivalent kernel, and a kernel is quite literally a kind of superposition of the training example. So can you unpack this for us?
Yeah, so I think starting from the master algorithm is actually perfect, because there are these 5 tribes, the 5 different paradigms. And what I argue in the book, and that's why it's called the master algorithm, is that what we really need at the end of the day is to unify all of them into a single one that can do what each one of them can, right? Each one of them is addressing a real problem, but sometimes people in that camp are under the illusion that that's the only problem, when in fact we have to solve all of them, right? And this paper is very much a piece in that puzzle. What this paper does is that it shows that in reality, deep networks are just kernel machines. So the connectionists are subsumed by the analogizers, which they might or might not like, but they are. And in fact, not just kernel machines, but the paper says that all models learned by gradient descent are kernel machines. And that encompasses a very large chunk of machine learning, including, for example, things like graphical models. So, because of this paper, a Bayesian network is actually kernel density estimation, right? So I think this, it's one theorem, right? But I think it has a lot of consequences, one of which is that I think it really moves us forward in being able to unify these different paradigms, right? But also I think, just to get back to this point, which is what people usually focus on most with this paper, of representation learning, right? You're right, the selling point for me and for everybody else of deep learning, in fact, I think it should be called representation learning. And that's why ICLEAR is called International Conference on Learning Representations, because that is the whole idea, right? And in fact, I think there's probably no more important problem in AI than how to learn representations, right? The thing about deep learning as we have it today is that I've always been a little skeptical that the problem has been solved. I don't think it has, right? And part of my skepticism comes from the fact that, really, you think gradient descent can learn representations? How exactly does that happen, right? And then the problem is that, again, I've been accompanying this for decades. I was doing deep learning before it was cool and whatnot. It's like, there are these fuzzy intuitions about the representation learning, but they never materialize into anything concrete. So I wanted to understand just what exactly is going on here, right? And I think, the papers, simple as it is a step forward in this, because what we now can understand is that what is going on in that big impenetrable mass of weights, right? That big mystery that, is bad for transparency, is bad for accountability, is bad for explainability, right? Is bad for, moving the technology forward, right? that big mass of weights is actually only apparent. What is going on in that big mass of weights is that the network has just memorized all the examples. But instead of memorizing them separately, as you do in a kernel machine, right? I really have a database of all the examples. It has superimposed them all into the weights, right? And honestly, this was an accidental idea, but it's one of the most brilliant ideas in the history of machine learning, right? Think about it from the point of view of kernel machines, right? The whole quadratic cost of computing the gram matrix goes away. The whole problem that I have to run through the examples at runtime and the memory cost and the time cost, all of that goes away. The examples are just superimposed in the weights, right? This is absolutely brilliant, right? And also, if you look at this from the point of view of the brain, which after all is what inspires connectionism, right? And neuroscience and psychology. This is also a brilliant idea, right? Like that evolution had, right? And now if you read some of the neuroscience, as I often do, because, I think you can take ideas from it. What strikes you is that it's so hard to parse what the brain is doing in terms of the concepts that we have, because these things all seem to be being done by all parts at the same time, right? It's not like, oh, there's this part that does this function, like in vision, this thing is doing shape and this thing is doing this type of shape. Everything seems to be being done, all over, right? Now we can look at this and go like, oh, I'm going to decompose what's going on here into all these components, and they're all on top of each other, right? Now I can look at a brain or transform and say this is what it's really going on there, right? Computationally, right, it would be ridiculous to actually separate all these things, right? But in terms of understanding what is happening, absolutely, that's what you need to do.
What I love about the paper is actually the fact that the path of training is contained in so you construct this kernel to make your case. And the path of training of the weights from the beginning to the optimum is part of that kernel. And I wanted to ask you this, because nowadays we often see models that train to zero loss, especially these large language models. They train and train and train, and at some point they get to zero training loss. So why the models generalize is kind of a mystery, right? Because they can just interpolate the training data. However, do you think the fact that you've shown that kind of the path of training is embedded into the weights, is that maybe a clue as to why these models generalize, even though they have zero training error?
Of course. And again, I think in some ways people have been focusing on the wrong thing. They're like, oh, this thing memorizes the data and still generalizes well. That's not a puzzle. We've always known that you can memorize the data and then generalize very well or very poorly. Right? Memorizing the data is not an achievement. Maybe for a neural network, once upon a time it was, but it's not, right? It's called the database, right? To memorize the data, you don't even need to learn. The whole question is what do you do on the points that are not in the data? And you can't answer that question just by looking at did you memorize the data, right? Because what matters is what happens elsewhere, right? And now I think the construction of the path kernel actually does help with that, right? And it helps with that in a number of ways. First of all, so the path kernel is computed as an integral over the path that the weights take during training, right? And one of the most important parts of that path is the beginning, right? One of the things that this really, I think, brings to the fore is the extreme importance of the starting point. Your initial random network is half the battle, right? With the random weights and its architecture. In fact, the architecture is where you've put all your knowledge. And in fact, is where people, there's this rhetoric, I don't mean that in a bad sense of rhetoric, with deep learning that we don't need knowledge, right? That's the beautiful thing about it. No more feature engineering, right? Isn't that great? But this is not true, right? Where have people spent all their time in the last 10 years? It's in engineering the architecture, right? And then you pick these random weights, right? But in fact, what you do is you don't pick one set of random weights. You pick a whole bunch of them, right? And then you average, which means, right, if you look at this from a Bayesian point of view, you're just averaging over your model class, right? So this all makes perfect sense, right? Most of what happens is determined by the initial network. And then you can get it to converge to fit the training data. But in terms of generalization, the initial network is as important as the convergence that you have at the end of the day. Number one. Right? Number two, what happens over the path, right? This is actually the thing that's very interesting, right? And is really the core of the theorem, right? Is that what is gradient descent doing? Like, it's moving, your weights, right, to make the network do better on the training examples, right? And the thing that I'm doing in this paper is essentially just running this very simple mental experiment. Is that, like, if I now take my test point, right, and just run the test point through the exact same process that the training points ran through, except it's not allowed to influence it, of course, because it was in the past, right? But I just run the training point through that. What happens? And now suddenly I think things become very clear, because what happens is the network, suppose, for example, that I'm just learning, incrementally with one example at a time, right? The weights are going to be adjusted to better fit the value for that function, of the function for that point. What does that do on the test point? If the gradient for the test point lines up well with the gradient for that training point, it will be affected similarly. If it's orthogonal, it won't be affected at all, right? So in the end, the effect of the training on the test point is a function of how similar that test point was to each of the training examples along the path. So the path really is the whole thing.
You were emphasizing the importance of the starting point, but I think that also indicates to me that there's just tons of symmetries that we're not exploiting, right? I mean, that you can start off in whatever, some infinite subspace and end up at a neural network that's basically just some transformation of every other solution that you would kind of optimize to. So have you found any clues in this work on how we might better constrain the initial starting point space to be a bit more efficient and exploit these symmetries?
Absolutely. So in fact, there's this whole area that has grown up in the last several years, and that I'm very much part of and really believe in, of symmetry-based learning, where what you try to do is understand what are the symmetries of the world that you're trying to model, and how should they be reflected in the symmetries of the network, right? And a classic example of this is convnets, right? Translation symmetry, right? You encode that in the network, and it really buys you a great reduction in sample complexity. So part of the answer that comes from my paper, and I allude to that briefly, is that what you can now do is you can encode into your kernel the same symmetries that you were encoding to the network before, right? What I should do, right, I should have the same ability to encode knowledge, in particular knowledge of symmetries, and some people would say that at the end of the day, that's all there is, into the kernel in the same way that I do into neural networks. And in a way, I remember through the decades, there was always this contest between the neural network people trying to hack the architecture and the kernel people trying to hack the kernel, right? And in some ways, the advantage of neural networks is that it's easy to put knowledge into it. But what this, what this paper shows is how you can put at this point, if you tell me, I have created a convnet by encoding into a translational symmetry, I know how to do that in a kernel, or other kinds of symmetry which we have incorporated into neural networks that can also be incorporated into kernels and so on.
Forgive me. I wasn't clear enough. What I was asking more is, you can imagine you can start at many random points in a space. You follow a trajectory to some optimum. What I was saying is, if you look at the trajectories over many different random starting points, can we learn anything by comparing those trajectories to one another that might lead us to more advanced symmetry representations?
I think we can learn some things, but others we can't. Right? So there's the knowledge that is encoded in the initial network, and the problem, of course, is that knowledge is insufficient, which is why you need data, right? So at some point, you have no choice, I think, but to randomize over your starting points, because you truly don't know what the weights should be. So you can put all our knowledge in, and you can put it interactively by running the algorithm and seeing what happens. But at some point, unless there's nothing to learn and you don't need the data, some of that is unavoidable. Now, do we learn something from what happens, in the paths? We learn some things, but not others. So if I started a bunch of random points and the paths are similar in some ways, that's actually a powerful hint, right? And I can learn from that. And maybe what I do next is I now start from a narrower, more constrained architecture, because I don't need those degrees of freedom anymore. And that's a gain, right? That's one side. But the other side is that red alert, right? You shouldn't mistake what happened with the paths going from one architecture from what could happen with all possible architectures, right? There's probably different architectures that would have different paths. So, what I would suggest is something like, don't just, and, people do this, of course, and there's meta, learning and AutoML and whatnot. It's you should try as many different architectures as you can, given the time allowed. And what is actually most interesting they're all useful, but the most interesting is not what happens with different paths from different random starting points in the same architecture, but what are the similarities that you get when you start from very different architectures? That's the part that I really want to know.
Just a quick one to close out. By the way, the symmetries thing's really interesting. We had Professor Max Welling on. He's the king and overlord of symmetries and models. And, recently he was involved in the SE3 transformer, I think, indirectly. But I guess what I want to get to is the more I learn about machine learning and AI, the more disappointed I am. Because, you've just given us a demonstration which should be disappointing to many of us that indeed neural networks just interpolate between the input points. I mean, Francois Chalet always used to say they were glorified hash tables. And in his measure of intelligence paper, which I think is quite cool, he said that you can reason about intelligence as being a function of the conversion efficiency of information, and also the generalization and the kind of the experience and the priors and so on, and of course there is this bias variance trade-off. But I suppose, should we be disappointed? I mean, I'm really excited about that you said the group was the evolutionaries, and we had Kenneth Stanley on, and I love open-endedness and population-based methods, and Chalet talks about neural program search, and where are we going to discover AI? Are we AGI? Are we anywhere close to it?
I don't think we're close to it, but in answer to your question, I think there's actually two ways to look at this. One of them pessimistic and one of them optimistic, right? But I think both of them actually have consequences for where we go with our research. The pessimistic view, which in some ways is the more obvious one, is that, wow, in the 70 years of machine learning and AI, we haven't gotten very far, right? And that may well be the case, right? It may well be the case that, at the end of the day, all these methods are just variations on nearest neighbor, right? And then if we really want to do representation learning, we really need different ideas. And I think there's a lot of research to be done there. We need people pursuing different ideas, not gradient descent, not backprop. Again, I'm all for gradient descent and backprop, but I don't think they'll get us to representation learning. What are some of these ideas? Again, I mentioned some of these in the paper, things like predictive coding, of course, genetic algorithms, structure mapping, the more advanced forms of analogy. There's actually a lot to explore there, but unfortunately, most of it is not being explored these days because, deep learning has sucked up all the oxygen. So that's the pessimistic view, which means we have a lot of work to do. It also means that we have a very exciting time ahead of us because there's all these great things to be discovered, right? So, I'm jazzed if that's the answer, right? As a machine learning researcher, right? There's lots to do and it'll be big. There's another view of this, which in some ways is it's the more optimistic one, and I also find it very intriguing, which is maybe that's all there is. Maybe you don't need more. Maybe the brain is also just doing similarity-based learning. In fact, a lot of psychologists will tell you that's exactly, Douglas Hofstadter, of course, has a whole book about this and whatnot. Maybe, we've just been overestimating intelligence because it's so mysterious to us. What we have in our brains is just a more sophisticated form of doing this thing of memorizing the data. And, maybe you can look at all of knowledge, even all of science, as that's all you're doing is you're memorizing your examples and then transforming and composing them in some way. And this is, of course, is brilliantly good news because it means we're actually a lot closer to AGI than we think we are. So either way, I think things look pretty interesting.
That's always been one of my fears, is that if we, or not fear, but just pondering, is that if we learn too much about ourselves, we're going to figure out people aren't intelligent either.
No, but they are. Well, I think, look, I think some of this is true, that once we understand intelligence, it will lose its mystery, right? And we will not overestimate it as much as we used to, but I think we will be more mature as a species when we do that, right? There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, look, the reality is intelligence does amazing things, right? It doesn't have to do them, we as a species can still be proud of our accomplishments, even if it turns out that intelligence is not that big of a deal. And by the way, to get back to this notion of the master argument, I think that once we understand the brain, it's, I think, overwhelmingly likely that we will understand that most of it is just evolutionary kludges that don't need to be there. So we'll be able to build brains that are as good as ours, but way simpler. Right? And again, we know all this from the level of the molecular biology, right? I've heard distinguished, molecular biologists tell me that, only people who don't know anything about molecular biology could believe in intelligent design. Because what goes on in the cell is such a pile of crap. Or like as somebody else said, nature doesn't refactor its code, right? This thing of refactoring your code does not exist in nature. So imagine what the code is like, right? So, I don't think once we find out that the brain, if we do find out that the brain is simpler than we thought, I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think it'll be a great thing.
It's a bunch of Perl code.
Yeah, I have a feeling that we won't ever understand it. We had a guy on from Oxford University last week talking about biologically plausible neural networks, and he's recreated, these networks with temporal spiking dynamics, and he's noticed all of this emergent phenomenon. I think it will be a case of we'll create some very complex dynamics which will emerge, but we won't necessarily understand them. But anyway, Professor Pedro Domingos, it's been an absolute pleasure, sir. Thank you very much for coming on our podcast.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.